take this off. Well, good morning, and sure it's good to be at the church again this morning, and just thank the Lord for His goodness and for all His blessings, and just for all the great things He did for me. I know I repeat myself a lot of times, but God has been so good to me, been better to me than anybody, and I know Brother Allen, he says that a lot, and but he's been good, really good to me, and I just thank the Lord for His blessings and the strength He's given me past year, and just every time I do get to do something that I hadn't did before, it's just a blessing. And I guess the last time I taught a Sunday school class, taught upstairs a long time to the young people, and I had to sit in a chair and I had to use my oxygen just to get up the steps, to get up there for the last few times. And I guess I'd probably, for a long time, I thought that was my last time I would stand in Sunday school class, but I give God all the glory and honor. I'm able to stand again, and He's just been so good to me, and I know I tell you a lot of times, I guess y'all get tired of hearing it, but I don't get tired of telling it. And Lord has blessed us, and just a short time ago, I'll just share this with you and we'll get started. But not long ago, before I had transplant, they would give me people that had transplants to call and to let them tell me how good it was, and how well they did, and they would talk to me about it, and now just a short time later that I'm getting to do that now to other people and try to help them, and just talk to some just the past couple of weeks and tried to encourage them and help them, and I've got a number of people that they give me names to talk to, and of course they have to call me, and it's just a blessing to get to try to turn around and help somebody after getting the help that we got. And I just it's been amazing, and I thank Him for His goodness. I thank Him for just all that He's did for me, and I just ask y'all that y'all just bear with me, and during this COVID-19, I've just tried to be so careful, and I don't want to be unsociable and not be friendly and fellowship like we used to, but I just try to be as safe as I can, and I know the Lord's going to take care of us, but I wouldn't offend none of you for nothing. Y'all been so good to me, prayed for them and helped us, and it's just a blessing to stand up here this morning. Just if I don't do nothing but testify, but I appreciate Perry asking me, and I want to thank him for the good job he does, and I know he said at the beginning he had big shoes to fill, following Brother David, and who that was a tough teacher to follow. That Brother David was unique, and nobody could teach like him, but God don't want us to be like somebody else. He just wants to be ourselves, and I think Perry does a really good job, and it's a task to teach every week in and week out, just for a long period of time, and just to be ready and the study it takes to prepare, and I appreciate him doing that and putting the time in. Appreciate Brother Wayne. He's good. He does good when he fills in and backs up, and I just love sitting back there. I know I taught Sunday school for a long time, but I've really enjoyed just sitting and listening during this time, and Lord just blesses us, and I enjoy that, and appreciate this week of revival. Didn't know again for a long time if I'd get to sit through a week's meeting, but the Lord blessed us to be here every night, and I just praise Him for that, and just how He helped us, and just a blessing. I talked to somebody yesterday and told them just that wasn't here, and just how that God had blessed us, His presence in the service every night, and just feel strengthened from the preaching this week, and encouragement. Brother Ricky preached to us every night, and it was just a blessing. I just thank him again for all his goodness. And if you will be turning to Luke chapter number 19, familiar passage this morning, and I just want to talk about something here that was on my heart. I just maybe a little different, but just couldn't get away from it. And when Perry asked me a few weeks ago, and I want to read a story about Zacchaeus. We'll start reading verse number 1, chapter 19. And I do want to leave a prayer request. Pray for Heather and John. Pray for their family, their church family. They had to close their church down last weekend. I had a lot of virus, people getting the COVID-19 in their church. Their pastor, Brother Griffith, had it. And so they didn't have service last weekend or this weekend. And I ask you pray for their church. They got a good church, good preacher, and pray for them that they'd be able to get back going. It's just difficult for them right now. Okay, Luke chapter 19, verse number 1. And Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, which was the chief among the publicans, and he was rich. And he sought to see Jesus, who he was, and could not for the press, because he was of little stature. And he ran before and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him, and said unto him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must abide at thy house. And he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all murmured, saying that he was gone to be a guest with a man that is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said unto the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have taken anything from any man by false accusation, I restore him fourfold. And Jesus said unto him, This day is salvation come to this house, forasmuch as he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. Of course, we all know this story. We heard it from when we was just little ones in Sunday school. We heard a story about Zacchaeus, wee little man. Remember that song we used to sing, the kids used to sing. And but this is, you read this story, and it's almost like two stories in one. It's about Zacchaeus before he met the Lord, and then the second part of the story, or Zacchaeus before he met, and then the second part is Zacchaeus after he met the Lord and the change that was made in his life. And we see that in verse 2 some things about him before. It said he was a chief among the publicans, and or a tax collector. And I guess they were kind of looked down upon that day, the publicans or tax collectors, and it would be like us talking about the IRS. I guess everybody frowns and don't want to talk to the IRS if you get a phone call or a letter from them. But that didn't make him a sinner, because he was a tax collector. That wasn't his problem. I'm sure everybody that works for the IRS there are probably some Christians that works for that group, and even though they do some difficult things and collecting money and all, but none of us wants to pay a lot of taxes. But he was a publican, and he was not just a publican, but he was the chief among the publicans. He was high ranking in that group. And we read about other publicans. Matthew, when he was called to be a follower, a disciple, he was a tax collector. But when Jesus called him to follow, he just left. He said he left the receipt of customs and followed Jesus that day. And he wasn't a publican or tax collector anymore after he got saved and started following Jesus. But it doesn't tell us in the story here if Zacchaeus stopped doing that, but that wasn't what made him a sinner, because he was a tax collector. And then it said he was in verse 2. He said he was rich. That wasn't what made him a sinner. there's been a lot of rich people in the world today and millionaires that were really true Christians that helped and gave a lot of money and supported things. And I know the owner of Chick-fil-A, what was his name? Truett Cathy. I know he was a good Christian man and a lot of money towards the right things, and others, there've been great men that families that gave money to the cause of Christ. But him being rich wasn't what made him a sinner. And it does mention that he was a sinner. Look at verse 7. The people that was there, that was, it was the place was just packed with people, and Zacchaeus couldn't see Jesus as he come through, and all these people that was in the way, they murmured. It said in verse 7, and it said, this man, that he was going to be a guest with a man that is a sinner. And they was talking about Zacchaeus, said he was a sinner. And but I want you to look and see that the thing that made him a sinner. Look in verse number 3. He said he sought to see Jesus, who he was. He didn't know Jesus. He wanted to get in the path to where Jesus was coming by, and that was why he was a sinner. He didn't know who Jesus was, and that's what people's problem is today that are sinners. It's not because of who they are or how much money they got, but it's just because they don't know Jesus. And Zacchaeus didn't know Jesus, but he wanted to know him. He was seeking to see him, and we see in this story, it's been said many, many times, when a seeking sinner comes in contact with a seeking Savior, then that person is a good candidate to get saved, and that's all right here. He was seeking Jesus, and in the last verse we read, it said the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. So we see the seeking sinner and the seeking Savior, and he wanted to know who Jesus was because he didn't, and that's what made him a sinner. It's because he had never met Jesus, and but he met him here. And then look at verse 5 and 6, and this goes back to what Perry said. Perry gave his testimony, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, about when he got saved. And notice that, remember what Perry said, and I say along with him, it's because when we're saved as a young person, and I'll say a little bit more at that minute, but when we're saved when we're young, it's not a great change. But there is still a change, that something happens within us. And he said, you remember he said, because he knew he was saved because he did what Jesus said. That's exactly what Zacchaeus did here. We don't see him praying a prayer. We don't see him, and I know we need to pray, and when we do pray to get saved, but look what he did. He did what Jesus said. Look in verse 5. It said, Jesus told him, he said, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down. He's up in the sycamore tree. Very next verse, look at it. Remember what he said. He said, Zacchaeus, make haste. It's worded just the same, verse 6. And he made haste and came down. He just did what Jesus said. He said, Zacchaeus, come down. He came down. He was obedient. Obedience what made the difference. So we see that's where the change came. And then down in the latter part of the verse, we see the second part of Zacchaeus. He said to begin with that it's almost like it's two stories. It tells a story about how Zacchaeus was before, and then now how he is after. And look, when he came down and received the Lord, it said he received him joyfully. He had joy in his heart. That was one of the differences. Now that he knew Jesus, he'd met Jesus, he had joy in his heart. He said he received him joyfully. And it wasn't just in his heart, but it was in his house. Look at the verse 9, what Jesus said to him. It said, this day has salvation come to this house. He had joy in his heart. He had joy in his household. And I know Dad said everybody has preached that salvation it's a household salvation. And it wasn't just Zacchaeus that got some help, but it was his whole household. So we see the change, the joy that was in his heart. And then just immediately after he came down, he said, Lord. He addressed Jesus. He knew who he was now. He had received him, and he was his Lord. And he addressed him as that Lord. And he began to talk to him, and he said, here's what I'll do, Lord. And he was a rich man. Remember, he was a rich man. He said, in verse 8, notice it said, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. So he said right to begin with, I'll give half of everything I got to the poor. Now that's a good sign that there was a change in his life. He was rich, had a lot of money, and that was a lot to give, but he gave half of his money to the poor. And then he said next, if I've taken anything from any man by false accusation, I'll restore him fourfold. And that was huge. And he said if he had, maybe he hadn't, maybe he had a lot, restore a lot of people. But we just see that his heart was changed. He went from being not knowing Jesus to knowing Jesus, and that's what we do when we get saved. And I guess if I had a thought today, and just would be this, just a life-changing experience. And Zach is the first one we wanted to talk about, and how he had a life-changing experience this day when he met the Lord, and when he was seeking Jesus, and Jesus was seeking him. He was not just seeking him, he was seeking all of us. And I remember the day that I got saved, and I'll tell you that, and it was a lot like when Perry shared his testimony a couple of weeks ago. And first, let me tell you when I got saved. If everybody's got a bulletin, I got saved that morning right there, July the 12th, in 1970, 50 years ago this morning, about an hour ago at 9:30. It was on Sunday morning. We lived in a little mobile home behind Morningside Drive Baptist Church, and a lot like when Perry got saved, he told his testimony. I know that morning, Perry and I was in. I remember the morning Perry got saved. Of course, I was older. I remember going there and praying with them that morning in his bedroom. And I don't know if you remember the morning I got saved. You were a lot younger, but we were in the living room playing, watching TV or something, and Mom called me and said, "Dad wants to talk to you." And I knew what he wanted to talk to me when I walked down that long hall into the bedroom, and he began to ask me, about being saved and how I felt at church when the altar call was given. That was a question I believe he started out with, and of course I was lost. God had already convicted my heart, and I remember going to church a lot of times before that. I know Dad remembers how it used to be, and Mom, but does anybody else remember back? This was in 1970, and when a preacher would preach and give the invitation, oftentimes people would get up and do what they call personal work. Does anybody remember that? Anybody remember that? And people would get up and when the preacher would start giving the invitation, and maybe everybody have their heads bowed, people would get up and go back looking for somebody to talk to ask them to come pray. And I can remember those days, and I remember just being scared when I knew that I needed to get saved. But somebody's going to come get me, somebody's going to come to me, and they weren't going to. I mean, I was just 10 years old, but I didn't know that. I just knew that I was lost, and I never will forget. We were at, I believe it was just me and Perry and Dad, but Mom may have been with us. But but I think it was a preacher's meeting. We went to Tilton Baptist Church. We lived in Dalton there, and it was the old Tilton Church, and this was a few weeks before I got saved. And Brother Benny Waters was there. I don't know, some of you may remember Brother Benny Waters. He was a pastor at 11th Avenue before Brother Ronald Guffey, before Brother Lloyd Guffey, and he was a pastor there at that time. But we were at Tilton, and he preached. I don't know what he preached on, but I just remember as we started out that night, I think Dad and Perry had already went out, and I was following, and he stopped me at the door, and he asked me, he said, "Son, have you ever been saved?" And I said, "No, sir." He said, "Well, you give that some thought." And I already knew, I needed to be saved, and I never got away from that. I remember that as vivid if it was yesterday. And just say this, just if you ever feel impressed, just to ask somebody about have they been saved, and just do it. I mean, they'll never forget it. If they're lost, they'll never forget you asking them that or speaking to them about the Lord. And I thank the Lord, He saved me that morning, July the 12th, 1970, 50 years ago this morning. The Lord saved me, and I hadn't always been what He would have me to be, but He's been faithful to me. And 50 years later, He knew that morning, and I believe this much. I'm standing here. He knew that morning I'd be standing here this morning. And I can't explain that, but that's just the foreknowledge of God. He knows everything. He knows the end from the beginning. He's the Alpha and Omega. He knew that, and I doubt if I'd been here, 3 or 4 years ago standing this morning. But I give Him the glory that I'm able to be here today and stand up here and talk to you just a little bit. And I just want to share my testimony and how good God has been to us. And I've doubted Him a lot of times, but He's never doubted. He's always been there to help me, and He's the same yesterday, today, forever. And I thank Him for that life-changing experience that I had. Again, like Perry, there was no great change that day or the next day or the next day or the next week or the next month or the next year. I looked back at my life and saw what happened that day. He changed the directions of our lives the day we got saved. He put us in the right direction. And 10 years later, Mary and I married when I was 18, and that was we have a lot of life-changing experiences in our lifetime. It's not just the day we get saved. There's a lot of things that we go through, but I know years later, 10 years, 20, 30, 40, now 50 years later, the direction of our life, He put the track He put us on. If I hadn't got saved then, I'd probably be dead in hell this morning. But I'm thankful that He saved me that day, changed my life, and didn't know, had, as you know my story, there's some bumps in the road this last few years, but He knew about that too. And I'm so glad that He's took care of us, and I just give Him the glory for that, for my life-changing experience. And I know you do too, and all of you that were saved when we were young. We're just as saved as as the person that's saved out of sin. And I'm so glad of that we can have a life-changing experience, and just praise Him. And just others, we won't take time to turn and read, but Paul had a life-changing experience, in Acts chapter 9 when he was, of course, on the road to Damascus, persecuting the church, persecuting Christians. And we all, that one is always referred to as people say they didn't have a Damascus Road experience. His was more traumatic, light shining down, voices, and he was blinded for a few days, but still the same God that saved Paul and changed him and changed his life is the same God that saves us and changes our lives. And he went from a persecutor to a preacher, and he wrote most of the New Testament. And what a change. What about Legion? Luke chapter 8, he was possessed and had those demons and devils in him. And then after he met Jesus, he was sitting clothed in his right mind at the feet of Jesus. And later we see him going and telling, witnessing, glorifying and praising God for everything that God had did for him. And the common denominator here is when they met Jesus, when Zacchaeus met Jesus, when Paul did, when Legion did. And then how about the woman at the well, John chapter 4? She was just there to get some water, and Jesus met Jesus. She'd never met Jesus before. She didn't know him either. And he began to talk to her about the water, about the well, and about worship. And she began to quiz him, and the change, the life-changing experience that she had was this, that she was living in sin. She'd had problems. She'd been married 5 times and living with another man, and Jesus knew that, and she was just so amazed that Jesus knew that about her and got her attention. And then at the end of the story, we see her going and publishing and telling others about it. And then we read about Nicodemus in John 3. He came to Jesus by night, and he knew that he'd heard about Jesus, but he didn't know Jesus. And he said, Rabbi, I said, we know that you must be of God. I'm paraphrasing, but you must be of God, or else you couldn't do all these great miracles. And of course Jesus began to talk to him about being born again, and about being changed and becoming a new creature. And Nicodemus, we see Nicodemus in the end of his life. He was there to help with the burial of Jesus 2 or 3 years later. I don't know exactly the time during his ministry when he got saved, when he met Jesus, but 2 or 3 years later, I guess it was, that we see Nicodemus in the end. And it said he brought 100 pounds of myrrh and aloe, I believe it was, for the burial of Jesus. And that was expensive, and so we see him giving and helping with Jesus, how he loved Jesus, and just we see all these changes, and it's a life-changing experience, and I just thank the Lord for the changes that he's had and made in my life and your life. And I mean, that's why we're here today. I mean, he changed the direction of our lives, and we could, like I say, I got saved in 1970, and I could have turned out to be a hippie or something. That was kind of the lifestyle in the late 60s and around 1970. Of course, I was 10 years old, but we about as hippie as I ever got, I guess, was wearing some bell-bottom pants, I guess, and we all did. But wear my hair as long as he would let me wear it, I would wear it. But it never was too long, but longer. And I had more of it then too. I had a lot more hair, but that was the direction of our lives. Is when Jesus comes into our life. And again, the common thing in all these we talked about was the fact that these people met Jesus, and you met Jesus, and I met Jesus, and that was the change. And as I said, every life-changing experience is some are more difficult than when we get saved. That's a great experience, and it's a good change. But sometimes things happen in our life that changes lives. Loss of a loved one or a sickness, and I know a lot of us have experienced that. Chris has, and I know Teresa has a breathing, and my heart goes out to anybody with breathing issues, because I know, and Brother Al and Brother Al with their hearts, and all their families experience things, and that changes our life when something bad, those are life-changing experiences too, and they're difficult when those things come, but I just remind you one thing, that when we experience a life-changing experience that we have that's difficult, just remember that the fact that Jesus said, and what Jesus didn't say it, but about Jesus, Paul said in Hebrews 13, he said, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, forever. And in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 6, he said, for I am the Lord, and I change not. And even though things change in our life, and things get difficult sometimes, and I've faced difficulty, but the thing about it, that God didn't change. He was always there to help us, and he has helped us, and I just give him all the glory and praise for helping us today. And I just appreciate the opportunity to stand. I thank the Lord one more time for just let me be able to. I guess a long time I didn't think I'd ever stand in a Sunday school class again. I just didn't have the breath or the wind to do it, and I appreciate Perry asking me, and I just hope that was a blessing, encouraging too. I know it was to me, just to get to, and thank you again for the offer. Just God bless all of you.